Our first panel is our big ideas through innovation, and I will hand over to James Cook, who will be moderating for the panel. Thank you.
It's not easy to open a conference, it's very easy to close one because everyone's either gone home or is half asleep at that point. But I hope we're going to have a very interesting chat today. I'm going to bring on our panelists now. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because they can do a much better job of that than I can. So we bring on our panelists. I think we have enough seats for me to not be behind a barrel, which is great. Fantastic. So why don't we go along? Oh, that's nice and comfy. Why don't we start by saying who you are, what you do, and what we're going to be chatting about today, which is big moonshots, big ideas, innovations, and these guys are very well placed to start with that. So why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Don Dodge. I work at Google, and I work on the enterprise side, dealing with Google Maps, Google Apps, Google everything for the enterprise. I'm also an advisor to Google Ventures and Google Capital on the investment side.
Hi, I'm Tania Boler, and 3.5 years ago, I was Director of Research, Strategy and Innovation at Mary Stopes, which is the largest private provider globally of women's health services. And then I quit my job and started up my own company in women's consumer tech. So that's called Chiaro, and our first product is LV. And we're all about pioneering smarter technology for women.
Hi, my name is Glenn Fogel. I work for a company called the Priceline Group. We're more well known in this part of the world for the company Booking.com that we own. We also own Kayak, we own OpenTable, we own rentalcars.com, we own a company in Bangkok called Agoda. We also own a number of small companies. And of course, the name Priceline.com is where we started. That's a US-based online travel company. I've been there 17 years. I run worldwide strategy, and I also run our corporate development group.
Hello, my name is Alex Kayyal. I work at Salesforce, and I lead Salesforce Ventures in Europe. As the name implies, Salesforce Ventures is Salesforce's investment arm. We have an active portfolio of over 160 companies all over the world, and delighted to be here.
Great. So one of the things we're going to be talking today is very, very big ideas and moonshots. And the sort of the nature of a moonshot is that it can fail and it can go wrong. Glenn, in case people don't know what a moonshot is, I think you're quite, sorry, Don, I do apologize. You're quite well placed to, I haven't had coffee yet, you're quite well placed to talk us through the moonshots that Google's working on, the sort of the mindset behind that.
Moonshots are big, big ideas that we wouldn't do in our normal course of business. So examples of moonshots at Google are self-driving cars, or Project Loon, which is giving internet access with these balloons that float over the Earth, all around the Earth, to bring internet to the third world. There are other examples, healthcare. We're doing a life extension thing to try to make it possible for people to live until 150. I'm not sure why anyone would want to, but we're working on it.
But it's not just sort of very large, well-funded companies with an infinite pot of money like Google that can do sort of these amazing big ideas. You know, Tania, of course, you're making a sort of new range of products for women as well. Do you find that difficult where you haven't got this sort of bottomless pit of funding to actually build new ideas and bring them to market?
I mean, I think when it comes to big ideas as well, you have to have, the stars need to align a little bit as well, right? So when it comes to women's consumer tech, you say consumer tech, basically we're talking consumer electronics linked to an app. You say women, the word innovation doesn't really come to mind at all. Right now, you have three big macro trends that are coming together, and that creates that demand. So we have a big feminist movement going on. We've got a huge technological revolution going on with the smartphones. And then, obviously, the third bit being, the whole kind of doctor-patient paradigm is switching more to kind of personal health. So you need to have that right kind of climate. In terms of funding, actually, I think here in the UK, for very early-stage startups, it's really good. We had over £600,000 in government R&D funding. You do need ring-fenced money, I think, for big innovations, because it is inherently very high risk.
And VC funds, is there a sort of appetite to fund these sort of big moonshot ideas, or are they still considered a little bit risky?
I think you need, so everything is, fads, right? So right now, everything, if you have AI in everything has AI in it, maybe you have a higher chance of getting the VC money. So 2-3 years ago, people talked about hardware revolution. There was suddenly a lot of excitement on Kickstarter and 3D printing. That has already begun to wane with the VCs because they've realized that there are reasons why consumer electronics in particular are difficult to fund. So I think with the VCs there, you just need to prove yourself a little bit more. So for us, we launched LV, our first product, and we just knew we had to get break even within 6 months, and we did it. And that's not the normal way of working for a startup, but sometimes, particularly when you've got something more innovative or women's tech and you're talking to male investors, you need to have to prove yourself a little bit more.
I think that's changed as well. I mean, I first moved to London 10 years ago, and just seeing the shift in the ecosystem in those 10 years is remarkable. I mean, I think there used to be a perception that if you had a crazy big idea, it could only get funded in the US and Silicon Valley. We're certainly starting to see that change, and actually the opportunity in Europe in particular for some of these, whether it's a moonshot idea, truly disruptive companies that are transforming their industries and their space are actually getting funded here, and there's a lot of structural reasons why Europe is poised to take advantage of that. So I think there's been a big shift, and in particular away from the consumer space, actually more and more in the enterprise B2B space. If you look at most of the billion-dollar companies that were started in Europe, a lot of them were consumer businesses. Now we're seeing that next wave of enterprise companies get started here. So we're very bullish and optimistic about what the next 5-10 years will look like.
And how often do you guys sort of come across these sort of genuinely sort of innovative companies? There's a lot of startups in Europe, within the UK as well. How often do you guys sort of come across startups that you really say, actually, you know what, this is really exciting?
Rarely. I mean, I look at hundreds of companies every year, and the number that are Me Too and old ideas, and it's interesting. A lot of the entrepreneurs who we meet with, and they're very excited about things, and say, well, somebody came up with that 2 years ago and it didn't work. And people need to do a little more of their homework, I think, in terms of when they're starting out. But of course, when you do find that, that gem, that's what makes life so exciting. I found the guys at Active Hotels, which was the first European acquisition we did up in Cambridge. These people had just graduated, and they had this very exciting way to sell hotels online. And then we ran in, and we met the guys at Booking in Amsterdam, and we combined those two companies. And from nothing, just a couple of people getting together with an idea, you now have a company that does the overwhelming majority of our profits and has created what we're now almost a $75 billion company. So you find those rare ones, and then it's just fantastic.
So one thing that I'm sort of very curious and interested in as a journalist is that there are companies that sort of bring about what seems to be real change, but often when we dig into them, they are, to put it bluntly, they're bullshit. And we've seen some sort of quite famous examples of that, both in the US and over here. How do we, as sort of members of the sort of tech ecosystem, to use an awful term, how do we sort of ensure against these companies which seem like they're doing these amazing moonshot ideas, but actually they're not so great?
Well, I think all startups look like bullshit to start with, because by definition, they're doing something that hasn't been done before, or they're trying something that seems crazy. If it wasn't crazy, everyone would be doing it. So by definition, they're going to be unusual and probably not fundable and all of those sorts of things. But you have to remember, the moonshot companies all started with just a couple of people. So Bill Gates and Paul Allen started Microsoft. It was just two of them. And Larry Page and Sergey Brin started Google in their dorm room in Stanford. And I remember going to their dorm room when they were still in school, and it was insane. I worked at Alta Vista at the time, and Alta Vista was the best search engine on the planet. And there were already 15 or 16 search engines. So why was Google the 17th search engine going to be a big thing? So every startup starts small. Every startup looks ridiculous when it starts, but you can't evaluate it that way. As an investor, what you're looking for is a great team with a great idea at the right time. Because as he said, you've seen lots of Me Too companies. It just wasn't the right time. So you always have to ask the question, why now? Why is now the right time to do this? And sometimes you'll see ideas that failed 2 years ago or 5 years ago and be tremendous successes.
If you think back to Newton, the Apple Newton, that first PDA, which failed miserably, but they kept on doing it, and eventually it iterates, and we have smartphones now. And it's a perfect example of where things may not work at the beginning, but as you say, 5 years later, it became something incredibly successful.
I was at Napster, so I was one of the early people at Napster, and it was an incredible idea, but it was too early. We failed, we got sued out of existence, and 3 years later, iTunes comes along. So timing matters.
It's funny you said the bullshit word, because for me as an entrepreneur, it's true, I'm on the other side of the table, right, always raising money, and we have to, we have to pitch all the time. So obviously we always, this moonshot idea is always bigger than it is. We're gonna get it out quicker than we really can, and we're never, it's either a mixture of, it's not just bullshit, it's also naivety, to be honest, which I think is quite a common thing for an entrepreneur. But I think to really, to go for the big ideas, obviously you need that visionary entrepreneur with a big idea, but you also need a visionary investor very early on who's going to take that risk. So when I look at our trajectory as a company, I had this big idea, it seemed crazy, and actually one of the first investors I pitched to was Alex Assaley, who started Jawbone, a $3 billion wearable tech company straight out of Stanford. And he just got it. He saw that even though it was high risk, it was a big opportunity, and even though there are many other naysayers, he was able to come in and support it, and I think those two ingredients can make such a difference.
I was just going to add, the word failure sometimes has a negative stigma, and it shouldn't.
Yeah.
I think entrepreneurs are trying to create something out of nothing and are really trying to innovate, and that kind of mentality around actually failing as fast as possible is great, and it means that you can kind of iterate and find product market fit, and I think sometimes that word carries a bit of a stigma. And it shouldn't. Most startup companies won't necessarily succeed, and that's absolutely fine. That's one of the best aspects of the entrepreneurial journey is discovering, is there another pivot that I can make here? And actually, a great founder and a great team can figure that out over the course of that journey. And so I think in particular, that's an area where Europe's gone much better, and more people are comfortable with taking that leap, and we need that, right? In the ecosystem, people need to be comfortable that if they go and try to build something and it doesn't work, that won't be looked down upon. Actually, it should be celebrated for trying.
And that raises an interesting point, because I think a lot of what we see within tech is we see a lot of failures, and that's okay because we understand that that's part of the ecosystem. But for people outside of tech who don't work in it, they see something like Fab, which raised $350 million and goes to almost zero. They see that, and they see it as a huge problem, and they see that as an issue within tech. Is there a way that we can sort of educate people into actually, this is meant to happen? Or actually do we just sort of carry on and let the failures happen as we go?
I wrote a story several years ago called Failure is Not an Option. And that story was about how startups will not allow themselves to fail. They'll try everything, every idea, they'll keep innovating until they find a way. And ultimately, they may fail, but usually they find a way. So I was at a conference in Europe, and this gentleman came up to me, and he said, I read your story about failure is not an option, and my CEO, by the way, this was a very large European bank that you all know. I won't mention the name. But he said, our CEO says failure is not an option. I said, oh, that's terrific. He says, no, Don, that's not good. Because what he means is if you fail, you're fired. And that's the problem with big companies. They need to allow for failure to happen. You can't have breakthrough success and big ideas without allowing for failure and iteration and innovation. And I think that's probably the biggest problem for big companies is that they don't have a culture that encourages innovation and allows for failure in order to get breakthrough success.
How do we change that? How do we bring in a culture that brings in innovation?
Well, Don, I was just going to say, though, but it's not as though the CEOs and so one day woke up and said, I'm going to be a guy who has all the wrong ideas that we won't let out. And they are being, pressures on them, when, particularly in today's environment, the big companies that are in their public companies, and they're being pressured by their investors, and this short-termism, as it's called, where people are expecting quarterly results, and they're saying you cannot invest something that's going to maybe be successful 3 years down the road in large amounts because we want to have that return today. And if you don't do that, we'll replace you with someone who will do that. So again, it's much more than just the individual management of these large companies. It's an entire business culture that has created it difficult for the larger companies to do that very entrepreneurial, make big moonshot type investments.
And we can't all split up like Alphabet and sort of isolate them off.
Well, that's exactly why Google split out Alphabet, for exactly that reason. Because Wall Street expects us to have continuously growing earnings every quarter, and if we're doing big moonshot ideas that are losing money, Wall Street doesn't like that. So we created Alphabet, and we set up these separate divisions to do the moonshot ideas so that it wouldn't impact our quarterly earnings. Or I guess it does in the total, but
But they can see it, there's transparency. And they
That's
say
right.
the core is still doing great, that's fine, and then they're okay with it.
That's
But
right.
if there's no transparency, that's where you run into trouble.
exactly.
I'd like to move on to talk a bit about the law. It's a big subject which sometimes gets overlooked within tech. You know, you've got companies like Uber which go into different localities and they kind of move ahead of the law, and often the law either catches up or they get banned. How do we fix that? Is that sort of a government involvement problem? Is that startups should actually act within the law and change how they operate? That sort of cat and mouse game between startups and the law and government agencies. How do we go about solving that?
Well, I've worked in government, so I know how slow it can be. No, I mean, I think startups, if you're going to be innovative, then you're going to be ahead of the law, and the law's going to have to catch up. It's going to be painful, but I think that's a natural part of change.
The nature of technology is it always moves faster
Yeah.
than the market can absorb it, and it certainly moves faster than the legal community and government can get around it. I've had personal experience with that. Napster was a stretch, and some thought it was illegal, and it turns out we did get sued out of existence. Uber is an example of something that's totally disruptive, and some places consider it to be illegal and ban it. Airbnb is another. So technology just moves very, very fast, and we need to allow the infrastructure to catch up, allow for government oversight to catch up. Self-driving cars is an example. So the technology is moving incredibly fast. We've had self-driving cars on the campus at Google for 3 years, driving around. But getting it to market involves government regulation, insurance companies. There's the practical matter of insuring this vehicle. And the insurance companies don't know how to deal with a car that doesn't have a driver. The government needs to know, how do you deal with these things, the regulations. So technology will always move faster than the market or government, and it generally works itself out. Look at Google. We're 17 years old, and we're still having issues with certain government bodies that live in Brussels about privacy or where data should live or the right to be forgotten or all these things. So I don't think it ever ends. We just have to deal with it as we go along.
So I don't know if anyone noticed, but there was an election in the US quite recently, and quite an interesting guy won. And I wondered if you guys think that there's a risk that sort of laws and the legal system could stifle innovation and sort of harm moonshots. We've seen that to an extent, but do you think there's a substantial threat to innovation from government, both in the US and around the world?
I'd say, one of the things that excites us the most right now is that we generally believe we'll live in an era where the customer matters more than ever before. And a big part, Salesforce as a company started in '99. We kind of pioneered in many ways the shift to the cloud and have been kind of this customer success platform the whole time. And I think there's never been a better time to be a customer of anything. I've said that many times, and it's something we believe at our core. You mentioned the example of Uber. Why is that so successful? Because fundamentally, consumers wanted that disruption. And I think that's what drives a lot of the innovation, whether it's in the B2B space or the B2C space. And I think right now we're seeing that trend of the voice of the customer being first and allowing kind of things to catch up. So that's kind of what excites us. And particularly, I think, where that innovation will be driven from is that free choice that consumers have to kind of dictate and vote with their dollars and kind of the app downloads they have around what's most exciting.
But it's interesting, and bring this back to the politics and the issue of regulations. And one of the things we see happening right now is this incredible speed of technology change. And it's upsetting people's feeling of where they fit in society, and that's translating into elections like in the States, where you feel a lot of people, I think, the anger of what's going on. And let's go with the example you mentioned, Uber. I love Uber, it's a great service. But the flip side of that is you've got a whole bunch of people who are being disrupted, the classical taxi cab owners and the drivers there. Go with Airbnb. Some people love it. Some people say, wait a minute, I got all these tourists down the hallway from my home. I don't like having this thing's turned into that. And go beyond. Let's go for Google and the self-driving car. And this is where you really start getting to something that could be very, very unsettling. The largest job in the US, I believe by number, is somebody who drives. I think that may be the largest number of jobs. Those jobs are going to be gone. The 3 million people who are just in a union, a driving job that's a union, what's going to happen to those people? You can't say, oh, we'll retrain them. What, they're going to become Java programmers? Please. It's absurd. So what are we going to do with millions and millions of people whose jobs are being disrupted? And it's happening, as Don just said, everything's happening much faster than the past. I mean, we're in the UK, and you remember back the Luddites, where did that come from? That came from the north when people's jobs were being eliminated by automation of weaving. Well, that's what's happening now, and that's creating this anger. And that's why we'll have these, this incredible people saying, I want to stop this, or I want to have someone, please, save me from what's happening. And that's disrupting.
And I think there's a danger with moonshot projects as well, and of course they're tailored to the people who produce them. Google extending our lifespan to 150 years, there's a danger that that will only be available to very rich people. So how do we ensure that the moonshots and innovations that come about from both big and small companies, that they are accessible to everyone? That's a big question, I know. But.
So the NASA program in the United States was literally a moonshot. And what happened was all of the technology that went into that moonshot of going to the moon was eventually implemented into all sorts of consumer-type applications, many, many things. The internet is the same way. It started out as a government military thing, as a way to communicate when communication systems were ineffective. And it proliferated out, and now we see it today. So I think that the big moonshots, let's take self-driving cars as an example, or machine learning, or these sorts of things. I too worry about self-driving cars and trucks putting professional drivers out of work. I think that would be a bad thing. I think what's more likely to happen is that it will be assisted driving, where it prevents accidents from happening, but the driver is still there. Similar to airline pilots. So many of you came here on an airplane. Airplanes have been self-driving for 20 years. The pilot still sits there, but he doesn't really do anything except for the takeoff and the landing. And I think with self-driving cars, what we're going to see is a similar thing where the car is autonomous in driving, but the driver is there. You always need the driver for those human interaction things, and it will be more of an assistance to avoid accidents and those sorts of things.
But is there not a danger that innovation within companies can stay within those companies and not trickle down? We've seen Apple do some great work on AI, but they don't publish any papers on this, and we can't sort of see what's happening there. How do we sort of make sure that the innovation that goes on within tech companies is made public and accessible to everyone?
Well, I'll use Google as an example of machine learning and artificial intelligence. We made TensorFlow available for free. We put it in open source and allowed anyone to use it. We acquired DeepMind, an artificial intelligence here in London, and we're making the APIs available to access this incredible technology so that anyone can access it and use it to do whatever they want.
And the nice thing of having cloud as a delivery model is that every single one of our customers gets access to the latest and greatest version that we've produced. Unlike the traditional software model where it's licensed, you may have something that's very outdated. We're releasing product on a yearly, multiple times a year basis, and so we're very excited about that. And kind of Salesforce has benefited from that tremendously. I think we're lucky to have been considered by Forbes one of the most innovative companies 5 years in a row, and a lot of that, in the kind of AI space, machine learning. In the last year, we're moving to make Salesforce with what we're calling Einstein be this predictive, intelligent Salesforce, and we're very excited about that. If you look at some of the acquisitions we've made, whether it's Richard Searcher with his company, Prediction.io here in the UK, which ended up then moving to the Valley. We've made a number of those acquisitions to bring that talent, and then we democratize that process by giving all our customers access to it. And I think on top of that, the way we think about it is because we have such an open platform, so companies are built on top of Salesforce either natively or by integrating into Salesforce on the App Exchange. The App Exchange has over 4,000 apps, whether it's companies like Evernote, Box, DocuSign, New Voice Media. Those are companies that are innovating themselves and bringing that innovation into the platform so that our customers can benefit. And so our model is really to it's in our DNA to keep that open and to help companies continuously innovate so that our customers can get the absolute best experience.
Let me go back to innovation and how it affects all of us. Many years ago when I started my career, we had travel agents. If you wanted to go somewhere, you had to call a travel agent to buy the ticket for you, right? Now there's Priceline. I haven't used a travel agent in 20 years. I can buy my tickets on Priceline automatically. I used to have a stockbroker. When you wanted to buy stocks, you had to call a stockbroker to buy the stock for you. But now I do it online automatically. I haven't used a stockbroker in a long time. There used to be secretaries that did administrative things in the office and set up things for you. Now we have email and we have automated systems for calendaring. I haven't had a secretary in 20 years. So those sorts of jobs, they still exist somewhere, but we adjust over time, and as long as there's enough time, people will adjust.
That's the key thing, is the time. And certainly a good examples you just gave, that people who have been able to find other ways to work, et cetera, it's really that rate of change that causes the uncertainty, the backlash against technology, against innovation, et cetera. But there's nothing you really can do about it, because those forces are going to continue and they're going to accelerate. And the use of open versus closed, with the perfect example of Don talking about opening up all the availability of all the power of Google. It creates such the incredible development of new things by people who have nothing to do with Google, but using the Google tools or using Salesforce. Accelerating all the types of innovation will cause things that are better for us, but things that will also have backlash. And that balance, it really does come from how the government's going to balance the regulations.
So I'd like to return back to the early stage for a while, and I wonder if you could talk us through LB, getting it off the ground, developing it. How difficult was that, and what were the pain points that you came across there?
So LV is our first product. It's targeting a very neglected area of women's health, which affects more than half of women, which is pelvic floor exercise, and it's something people don't talk about. So, but it's absolutely critical, particularly for women who have babies and particularly women during menopause. So for us, there were just a whole range of problems, apart from the fact that there was no technology, no innovation, but it was about changing the whole conversation and not talking about yucky health problems, but making this more about strong women being proud of your bodies. And I do think actually it resonates for other big ideas too. Often the innovation is not just on the technology, because if it's a new category, you are literally changing the paradigm, you're changing the way people are thinking about certain things. So the two need to go hand in hand, and you have to make sure not only do you have this big technological innovation, but you're also innovating on the branding and communication side.
And from the investor's point of view, when you sort of raised money, what could investors do to help sort of bring new products like yourself into the market? Is that sort of being more keen to meet sort of newer startups? Is that having a sort of different mindset, a different approach to things? How was that process for you?
Well, as I think I said, so when I bought my very first investor, they were like, how long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? And I was like, oh, £200,000. It's like back of the envelope, 1 year. And it cost obviously $1 million and took several years. So say you need investors who are patient and know, particularly with hardware, it's going to take a little bit longer, and particularly if you want those bigger ideas, that their risk appetite has to be different.
I think innovation in big companies is actually harder than innovation in startups. Because startups, by definition, they're focused on something that's new and innovative, and they're not constrained by legacy systems or legacy customers. They have a green space to work with. In big companies, it's quite the opposite. You have customers that you have to support. You have legacy systems you have to support. You have investors that you have to support. So taking big risks and doing innovation in big companies, I think, is actually harder than it is in small companies.
Well, and because of the way the incentives for compensation are done in big companies, where you have certain targets, certain budgets are put together, and you will get your bonus, or you're tied to your stock price, and the risk of killing all that, that's fairly, you feel good that you'll get. If you just do what you're doing right now, you're not going to blow up the company. If you take the risk, you may blow up the company, and the whole compensation plan is designed for you not to blow up the company.
And similar to what you were saying, how it's important in Alphabet to ring fence the high-risk innovative department. In the big company I worked in before, nearly 10,000 employees, we were that tiny innovation unit, doing all the cookie-cutter innovation things, creative thinking, innovation metrics, all that kind of stuff. And it just didn't have any impact in such a big organization. As you're saying, obviously I got frustrated. Now we're 20 people. We're inherently innovative all the time. But it comes down to even building the team, the people we bring in. I'm looking for those slightly unusual thinkers, the big picture thinkers. And it is highly, even with our second product, we are creating all the time. But I'm also aware we're 20 people. In 3-5 years, when we're 500 people, these highly innovative, high-risk takers are not going to be the right people to be leading that team in the future. So then the question is, how do we make sure that DNA stays there as well?
And I think Tania, I think one of the super interesting things about what you said is the undertone there, I think, is a lot about entrepreneurs being super thoughtful about who they bring in as investors. I think first-time founders often make this mistake of kind of making that decision very quickly, not realizing that it's almost a 7 to 10 year bet who you bring in, at least. And so finding the right partner for your business is super important. And so we think of ourselves as strategic investors. We like to co-invest with traditional VC firms because we know there's certain things that we want to help the company with. And so entrepreneurs really should be very tactical about what is the right partner I'm going to bring in. And at different stages of the company, they might need different help. In the early days, someone that's an angel that might have experience in the market and can bring credibility and advice versus, as a Series A investor, which is where we focus, looking at access to customer base, access to the product, et cetera. So I think, the nice thing about the ecosystem is that there's now plenty of capital at each of those stages. We can still do more, but there's certainly been more and more options for entrepreneurs that they should take advantage of.
I think big traditional companies that they try to do acquisitions to bring in innovation. And the best way for that to work is to allow the small companies that you acquire to be autonomous.
Which Google's very good at, right, with DeepMind.
Right.
And Nest, how did that kind of...
Yeah.
What were the learnings? No, just interesting to know, because that was kind of an attempt for Google to go more into hardware, wasn't it, as well? And
Yes, yeah. So we'll try anything, and we aren't constrained by what we do today or what the conventional wisdom is. We'll try anything. Self-driving cars is an example. But back to the big traditional companies, it's easy for us. It's easy for Priceline and Salesforce. We're tech companies, so when we acquire tech companies, it's really easy. It's natural for us. But for traditional old-line companies, when they acquire a very innovative technology company, one of two things happens. They either get absorbed into the big company and get constrained by all the traditional rules and procedures and eventually lose all their enthusiasm and it just sort of dissipates, or they take these innovative startups and put them aside and sort of ring fence them and let them do their thing, so they get the advantages and the leverage of a big company, but the freedom to innovate as a small company. I think that's the better way to do it.
I just say absolutely. Peter Drucker, one of the greatest management thinkers of the 20th century, he wrote in a book 40 years ago about entrepreneurship about how the old big company almost inevitably crushes the new acquired for all the technology, all the things you brought them in for, and you destroy it. Very hard to do, and I think what Don just said about you've got to be able to let those people be who they are, and if you don't, why did you buy it? And everybody here who's at a small company, you're thinking, what's the exit going to be? I cannot urge you enough, be very careful who you decide to get married to. It's just like real marriage. You're going to be with them for a long time. You better really like them, and you better understand what the relationship's going to be after you sign the deal and take the check.
And one interesting, to Glenn's point, I think the next few years will be very interesting from that perspective on the M&A side, because I think we're seeing a trend where the non-traditional buyers are trying to buy tech companies. So this year in particular, you've seen companies like GE, Unilever, the list goes on, where all of a sudden it's no longer the traditional tech companies that are being acquisitive. It's actually expanding beyond that. And I think that'll be, the buyer universe has started to expand tremendously across different types of businesses, which as an entrepreneur is great, right? Because all of a sudden that means from access to delivering your vision long term, there's an even bigger group of companies that can help you get there and create a liquidity event.
And I think also one of the things we keep hearing about here in the UK startup scene is, why aren't we getting the unicorns, the billion-dollar companies, and are we selling too early? And that's obviously due to so many different factors. But we don't have. I think we're very good at the angel investment rounds, the Series A, and then there's a funding gap, for the companies that want to maybe raise 100 million, so then they exit fairly quickly, and then they're not seeing their full potential as well.
Do you think there's a danger that Europe just becomes an easy way for multinational companies to acquire innovative little companies and absorb them, and that's it? And here in Europe, we're left with what's left of that.
So we've been going for less than 3 years, and we've had 3 huge multinational companies already approach us for acquisition, and that's really early. And it's flattering, but there's right now there's definitely they're all the P&Gs, the Unilevers, they're all kind of freaking out, aren't they, that they've missed out on what's happening in the tech startup scene. So there's a lot of quick acquisitions going on. But I listened to what you're saying as well. It would be a complete mistake to just jump at the first opportunity and all the rest of it. And I know for us, for what we want to do, it's going to take 10 years, so this isn't a quick thing.
And how do we, as a sort of ecosystem, allow European companies to do that? Because the tendency, I think, for many founders is to grow to a certain point and sell to Twitter or Google or whoever and go to the beach for a little while. How do we sort of ensure that they have the opportunity and the pathway to grow and raise more money and go public? Is that fixing that funding gap that you mentioned? Or is there something else that larger corporates can do to help that?
Well, I mean, the typical thing for the startups, same, we very confidentially just raised our Series A here in the UK, which is very exciting. We're already looking. We know that for the Series B, we'll go to the US, we'll go to California to raise that money. So there is a sort of exodus. Either you raise the money in the US or you sell out a little early.
Are you planning to keep your HQ in the UK? Are you going to move over to the US permanently?
Well, with the whole currency thing at the moment, definitely the UK.
That distinction is folding away, though. I mean, I think, to the question, James, we see the distinction kind of collapsing in some ways. Companies are started in one location, they grow all over the world.
Yeah.
It's less siloed than it probably was 5 or 10 years ago, where a company started matters less and less.
Yeah.
And they're able to, whether it's distributed teams or keep their engineering teams in one location and then grow commercially in the US. We've seen that as a very successful bridge. Where oftentimes a bigger and bigger share of the revenue actually ends up being in other markets from where they started. And I think Europe has a great advantage there because some of the countries are so small from a population perspective. You think global on day one, right? If you start a company in the US, internationalization is a much later down the line. If you start a company in Sweden, you're thinking about the rest of the world instantly. And that's a great advantage that European companies can take advantage of.
Yeah, I think today, a startup is global on day one. The internet has changed everything. So that when you're a tiny little startup with a website, on day one, you're available globally. The problem is that entrepreneurs have to think globally. They have to think beyond their own market. And money is available anywhere now. So I think a lot of things have changed. One, the internet has made businesses global from day one. 2, money is available everywhere, and money will go to wherever the technology is. 3, entrepreneurs have to think globally, because I've seen many of them that think about their local market and are kind of timid about going to the international markets, but it's there. They just have to go for it. And in terms of startups and where they end, the reality is that about 50 to 60% of all startups will fail. They'll go out of business. That's It's always been that way and probably always will. So 50 or 60% are going to die and reemerge and do something else. Maybe 10% of them go public, and that 30% in the middle usually gets acquired. The most likely outcome for a successful startup is to be acquired, and the investors and the founders think that way. They want to be acquired, and most of them don't want to be a CEO of a gigantic company. It's not what they do. I've seen many, many founders start serial entrepreneurs, start 4 or 5 companies because they want to start them, get them up to a level, sell them, and then go and start over again and start a small one because that's what they do. They're creators. They don't want to be a CEO of a $100 billion company. So I think it's more in the hands of the founders to decide what ultimately happens to them. It's not forces of money or government or big companies that are forcing them to do that. It's their decision.
It's also the investors. I mean, once the VC comes in, they have a very clear plan on when, and particularly in the UK, they're looking at a 3 to 5 year exit, and that does create a certain force. But
Yeah.
hopefully, the founder still has enough control around the destiny.
But if things are going great and you're making money, those investors are quite happy to continue the ride and make more money.
But as Alex pointed out, it's be careful who you take the money from, because some will have different ideas about what you have to do and when you have to do it. And there's nothing worse than having a divorce happening between the founders and your money suppliers. That can be very ugly. So the same way I say be very careful who you get acquired by, be very careful beforehand who you decide to take money from, because that will be a very big determinant in who you may get acquired by down the road and when.
That is the dirty secret of venture capital, is that these venture capital investors can force you to sell your company before you want to. Because if they get an acquisition offer for 10 times their money, the investors are going to say, we're taking it, even though the founder might not want to do that.
So we have 1 minute left on stage, and there's one subject I want to touch on. In that, talking of VCs, Boulderton Capital, a VC fund based in London, they surveyed their companies, and they said the biggest concern that these companies have is access to talent and hiring. And in the wake of the EU referendum result here in the UK, they're concerned about that. In your view, does Brexit and the immigration effects of that, the potential ones, does that have a knock-on impact on innovation?
Definitely. Unfortunately, there's a huge shortage here in London and in the UK if you want to hire a developer or anything. A lot of our team members are from Europe. It's a way to get really ambitious people in who have skills that we haven't been training up here in the UK. So I do see that there will be a long-term knock-on effect.
Uncertainty is bad for making plans for the future. So until we know what the new rules will be, a lot of people are trying, we have to put things on hold, or we're just going to hope for the best and go down a path. But those people are a little braver than, I think, the majority. The majority of people are saying, gee, we'll just slow things down a little bit until we know.
The nice thing about entrepreneurs is they kind of win against all odds. And some of the best companies in the world have been started in market downturns and very challenging times. And I think one of the things that makes a great founder is navigating those complexities and still persevering and finding ways to build a great business. So we're all lucky that we're surrounded by that energy and that entrepreneurial spirit. And I think we'll keep looking for that.
That's a good note to end on. I don't want to use up any more of your time. Of course, the Duke of York's probably going to be waiting in a bit as well. So thanks very much for the panel. Really interesting chat. We covered Trump and Brexit, so I'm happy. So thanks very much, guys. Appreciate that.
Thank you.